In the winter of 1847, something impossible happened in the quiet town of Millbrook, Massachusetts. A room in Ashford Manor began to speak, not with one voice, but with dozens. Men, women, children, all crying out from behind walls that had stood silent for nearly a century. The discovery would drive 3 investigators to madness, expose secrets that shattered New England's most powerful families, and prove that some houses don't just remember the past, they preserve it in ways that defy every law of nature. Before we descend into the horror that consumed Ashford Manor, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and comment which state you're watching from. Now, let me tell you about the house that learned to scream. Ashford Manor sat on 18 acres overlooking the Merrimack River, built in 1752 by Josiah Ashford, a merchant who made his fortune in the triangular trade. The house was Georgian in style, 3 stories of red brick with white columns, 23 rooms connected by hallways that seemed to shift depending on who walked them. Local children whispered that the house was hungry, that it ate people who stayed too long, but adults dismissed such talk as superstition. The Ashford family had lived there continuously for 95 years, each generation adding to the house, expanding it, modernizing it, but never quite able to make it feel like home. Servants refused to work there for more than a few months. Guests reported nightmares so vivid they woke screaming. And every decade or so, someone would disappear from the property entirely, vanishing without explanation or trace. By 1847, the house belonged to Margaret Ashford, 63 years old, the last surviving member of her line. She lived alone, except for 2 servants who came daily, but refused to sleep under that roof. Margaret was a formidable woman, tall and thin with silver hair pulled back severely, eyes that missed nothing. She had never married, dedicating her life to managing the family business interests and maintaining the house that her ancestors built. In November of that year, Margaret made an unprecedented decision. She would hire investigators to examine the house's history, to document the disappearances, to explain the phenomena that had plagued her family for decades. She contacted the Society for Psychical Research in Boston, offering substantial payment for a thorough investigation. The society sent 3 people: Dr. Edmund Hartley, age 42, a physician with interest in abnormal psychology. He was a skeptic who believed every supernatural claim had a rational explanation, usually involving fraud or mental illness. His notebooks were filled with debunked seances and exposed mediums. Constance Webb, age 35, a spiritualist who claimed sensitivity to what she called emotional residue, left in places where trauma occurred. She had assisted in 17 investigations, finding evidence of genuine phenomena in 3. She approached each case with cautious openness, willing to believe but demanding proof. And Thomas Whitmore, age 28, an architect specializing in historical buildings. He was hired to map the house's structure, to find hidden rooms or passages that might explain the disappearances. Thomas believed in facts, measurements, blueprints, physical evidence. Everything else was speculation. They arrived on November 15th, a grey afternoon with the smell of coming snow. Margaret met them at the door, her expression unreadable. "Welcome to Ashford Manor," she said simply. "I hope you find what you're looking for, though I suspect you'll find much more than that." She led them inside. The entrance hall was enormous, with a curved staircase rising to the 2nd floor. Portraits lined the walls, Ashfords going back generations, all sharing the same intense eyes and thin mouths. The house was cold, despite fires burning in several rooms. Not the natural cold of November, but something deeper, more penetrating. Margaret provided them with a library on the 1st floor as their base of operations. She gave them access to family records dating back to 1752, journals, ledgers, correspondence, legal documents. Everything was meticulously organized, as if she had been preparing for this investigation for years. 3 rules, she said. First, the 3rd floor is locked. It has been for 40 years. Do not attempt to open it. Second, if you hear knocking from inside the walls, mark the location and time, but do not respond. Third, if you see a door where no door should be, do not open it. Do you understand? Dr. Hartley frowned. Mrs. Ashford, with respect, we need complete access to investigate properly. You have access to everything that matters. The 3rd floor is dangerous, not because of ghosts, but because the structure is unsound. The floorboards are rotted. The ceiling is collapsing. I will not be responsible for injuries. She was lying. They all sensed it, but they agreed to her terms. The first 3 days were routine. Thomas measured and mapped, creating detailed blueprints. Dr. Hartley interviewed Margaret about family history, documented claims of phenomena, established a baseline of normal activity. Constance walked through every accessible room with her eyes closed, hands extended, feeling for temperature changes and emotional impressions. They found nothing unusual. The house was old and creaky, yes, but no more so than any structure built nearly a century ago. No ghostly apparitions, no mysterious sounds, no evidence of anything supernatural. Thomas did notice architectural oddities. The house's internal dimensions didn't quite match its external measurements. There were gaps, spaces unaccounted for, small discrepancies, easily explained by thick walls or storage areas, but peculiar nonetheless. On the 4th night, everything changed. Dr. Hartley was working in the library at midnight, reviewing family journals. The house was silent except for wind-rattling windows. Margaret had retired hours ago. Constance and Thomas were asleep in their respective rooms on the 2nd floor. Then he heard it, a knock from inside the wall behind him. Not loud, but deliberate. 3 slow knocks, pause, then 3 more. He stood and approached the wall. It was solid plaster over brick, no obvious openings. He knocked back experimentally, 3 times. Silence for perhaps 20 seconds. Then the knocking came again, this time from a different section of wall, and this time it was answered by more knocking from across the room, and more from the ceiling, and more from beneath the floor. Within a minute, the entire library was alive with knocking. Not random, but coordinated, as if dozens of people were trapped inside the walls, all trying to signal their presence. Dr. Hartley's rational mind scrambled for explanations. Pipes, rodents, settling foundation. But the pattern was too deliberate, too responsive. He ran from the library and nearly collided with Constance in the hallway. She was pale, trembling. "You hear it too," she gasped. "The entire house is knocking." They woke Thomas and Margaret. All 4 stood in the entrance hall as the knocking continued, moving through walls like a wave, surrounding them. Margaret's face showed no surprise, only grim resignation. "It's starting again," she said quietly. "It happens every 20 years or so. The house remembers, and it tries to tell us." "Tell us what?" Thomas demanded. "Where they are. Where all of them are." The knocking continued through the night, finally fading with dawn. The investigators spent the day comparing notes, trying to rationalize what they had experienced. Dr. Hartley suggested mass hysteria. Constance believed they had awakened something through their presence. Thomas wanted to tear open the walls to find the source. That evening, Margaret finally told them the truth, or part of it. "This house has consumed 17 people over 95 years. Not killed, consumed. They didn't die and leave bodies. They simply ceased to exist in our world and began existing in the house's world. She pulled out a leather-bound book from a locked drawer. It was a record kept by every Ashford patriarch and matriarch since 1752. Each entry detailed a disappearance, names, dates, circumstances, and afterward, phenomena associated with the vanished person. The first was in 1756, a house slave named Patience, age 16. She went to the third floor to clean and never came down. Searchers found nothing, but for months afterward, servants reported hearing a girl crying behind the walls, calling for help in Patience's voice. In 1769, Josiah Ashford's own son, William, age 12, disappeared from his bedroom. The door was locked from inside. The windows were bolted. When his father broke down the door, the room was empty. William's voice was heard in the walls for years, asking why his father didn't come find him. The pattern continued through generations. A tutor in 1783, a maid in 1791, a guest in 1804, a groundskeeper in 1818. Each vanishing followed by voices, by knockings, by evidence that the person was still present somehow, just displaced into a space that existed alongside the physical house, but not quite within it. The last disappearance was in 1827, Margaret said. My brother, Daniel, he was 23. He went to investigate the third floor against my father's warnings. We found his pocket watch on the stairs, still ticking. But Daniel was gone. For 20 years, we have heard him knocking, heard his voice calling from inside the walls. And now the house is waking again, and I fear it's hungry. Dr. Hartley wanted to dismiss it all as delusion, but he had heard the knocking. They all had. And when he examined the record book, the handwriting changed with each generation. These were not fabrications by one mad person, but consistent accounts across nearly a century. We need to open the third floor, Thomas said. If there's a physical explanation, it's up there. No one opens the third floor, Margaret said firmly. My grandfather sealed it after Daniel disappeared. He said what's up there must never be disturbed. Mrs. Ashford, Constance spoke gently. If your brother and the others are truly trapped somewhere in this house, don't we have an obligation to try to help them? Margaret's composure finally cracked. Tears filled her eyes. You don't understand. The house doesn't just take people, it changes them. The voices we hear aren't calling for help anymore. They're calling for company. They want others to join them. And every time someone tries to investigate, the house takes them too. Despite Margaret's warnings, they made their decision. That night, they would open the third floor. The door to the third floor was at the end of the second floor hallway, hidden behind a bookshelf that Thomas and Dr. Hartley moved aside. The door itself was unremarkable, painted white, but sealed with 6 iron bars bolted into the frame. It took them an hour to remove the bars. Margaret refused to help, refused even to watch. She stayed in her room with the door locked, as if distance could protect her from what they were about to unleash. When the final bar came free, the door swung open on its own. No creak of hinges, no resistance, just smooth, silent movement, as if it had been waiting. Beyond was darkness and a staircase leading up. The air that wafted down was wrong, too warm, too thick, smelling of dust and something organic, like old flowers rotting in a closed room. Thomas went first, carrying a lantern. Constance followed, then Dr. Hartley. The stairs were steep and narrow. At the top was another door, this one unlocked. The third floor was a single enormous room stretching the length of the house. and it was impossible. The ceiling was 30 feet high, far taller than the roof should allow. The walls were covered in writing, thousands of words carved into plaster, scratched into wood, written in what looked like dried blood. Names, dates, messages. I am still here. Help us. The house is hungry. We are in the walls. But most disturbing were the doors. Dozens of them set into the walls at irregular intervals. Doors of different styles and periods. Some looked original to the house. Others were clearly from different eras, different buildings entirely. And behind each door, they could hear sounds. Breathing, movement, whispers. "My God," Dr. Hartley whispered. "What is this place?" Constance moved to the nearest door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Thomas grabbed her wrist. "Mrs. Ashford said not to open doors that shouldn't exist. But we need to know. We need to understand." She pulled free and opened the door. Beyond was not another room. It was a space that hurt to look at, dimensions folding in on themselves, geometry that violated basic laws of physics. And in that impossible space, they saw people. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Men, women, children, all standing perfectly still, all staring out at the investigators. Their clothes spanned centuries. Colonial dress, Victorian gowns, more recent attire. These were not ghosts, not spirits. They were solid, real, but trapped in a dimension that existed between walls, between moments, between the spaces where reality cohered. One figure stepped forward, a young man with dark hair and intense eyes. Margaret's brother, Daniel, still 23, despite 20 years passing. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice perfectly clear. "Now the house knows you're here. Now it will keep you." Constance stumbled back. Thomas slammed the door shut. They ran for the stairs, but the door at the bottom was gone. Where it had been was now solid wall. "No, no, no." Thomas ran his hands over the plaster. "The door was right here. We just came through it." More doors began appearing in the third-floor walls. Dozens of them, hundreds, each one opening slightly, showing glimpses of that impossible dimension and the people trapped within it. The walls began to whisper, not with one voice, but with hundreds. All the people the house had taken over 95 years, all trying to speak at once. "Stay with us. You can't leave. The house is hungry. We are so alone." Dr. Hartley's rational mind broke. He began screaming, tearing at the walls with his bare hands, babbling about dimensions and physics and how none of this was possible. Constance tried to calm him, but she was nearly catatonic herself, overwhelmed by the emotional residue of centuries of trapped souls. Thomas was the only one still thinking clearly. He studied the room, noting that the doors appeared and disappeared, but the walls themselves remained constant. The writing on the walls, if he could decipher it, perhaps it explained how to escape. He forced himself to focus, reading the desperate messages carved by previous victims. Most were pleas for help or expressions of despair. But one, carved near what he thought was the original door location, was different. "The house feeds on presence. To leave, you must make yourself absent. Stop existing here, and you can exist elsewhere." It made no sense. How could someone stop existing? But then Thomas understood. The house trapped people by acknowledging their presence, by holding them in its awareness. If he could make himself unnoticeable, perhaps the house would forget him long enough to escape. He closed his eyes and began what seemed like meditation. He slowed his breathing, quieted his thoughts, tried to make himself as still and silent as possible. He imagined himself as nothing, as empty space, as a gap in reality rather than a presence within it. The whispering around him faded. The sounds of Constance and Dr. Hartley grew distant. He felt himself becoming less substantial, as if his body was losing solidity. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in the second-floor hallway. The bookshelf was back in place over the third-floor door. He was bleeding from dozens of small cuts, his clothes torn, but he was out. He ran to Margaret's room and pounded on the door. She opened it, taking in his appearance with horror. "Where are the others?" she demanded. "Still up there. The house has them." Over the next 3 days, Thomas tried everything to reach Constance and Dr. Hartley. He removed the bars again, but when he opened the door, the stairs were gone, replaced by solid brick. He tried accessing the third floor from outside, but the house's exterior showed only 2 stories, no matter what the inside suggested. Constance and Dr. Hartley were simply gone, added to the house's collection of 17 souls, now 19. Margaret was unsurprised. "I warned you. The house always takes payment for investigation." Thomas should have left then, should have fled back to Boston and never thought about Ashford Manor again. But he couldn't abandon Constance and Dr. Hartley, and he had begun to understand something about the house's nature. He spent weeks in the library, reading every document, every journal, every scrap of Ashford family history. He learned that Josiah Ashford had not simply been a merchant. He had been involved in esoteric practices, had studied with occultists in London before coming to America. The house had been built according to specific principles, its architecture designed to create liminal spaces where the boundary between dimensions was thin. Josiah believed he could create a sanctuary, a place that existed partially outside normal reality, protected from time and decay. But something had gone wrong. The spaces between had opened too wide, creating a trap instead of a sanctuary. And once the house learned to consume people, it developed a hunger that could never be satisfied. Thomas found blueprints in Josiah's own hand, showing the house's true structure. The third floor was a focal point, but there were other access points throughout the building, spaces between walls where dimension folded. And at the house's center, beneath the cellar, was what Josiah called the heart room, the source of everything. On Christmas Eve, 1847, Thomas descended to the cellar alone. Margaret tried to stop him, but he locked her out. The cellar was ordinary at first glance. Storage rooms, coal bin, wine racks. But Thomas had Josiah's blueprints. He knew where to look. Behind a false wall in the wine cellar was a narrow passage leading down. He followed it, lantern held high, descending deeper than should be possible. The passage opened into a chamber carved from living rock, and in that chamber was something that defied description. It looked like a door, but it existed in too many dimensions at once. Looking at it directly was impossible. The mind couldn't process its geometry, but Thomas could see, peripherally, that it pulsed with light, that it opened onto somewhere else, somewhere vast and dark and hungry. This was the heart. This was what Josiah had opened, thinking he was creating a sanctuary. He had instead created a wound in reality, and the house had grown around that wound like scar tissue. Thomas understood now. He couldn't close the heart. It was too late for that. But he could feed it something so large, so overwhelming, that it would be satisfied long enough for the trapped souls to escape. He could feed it the house itself. What he did next took 3 days. He worked methodically, placing oil-soaked rags throughout Ashford Manor. He documented everything in notebooks he would later hide in the library. He wrote letters explaining his actions, though he knew most people would think him mad. On December 27th, he brought Margaret outside. She understood what he planned and did not resist. Will it work? She asked. I don't know, but the house has been feeding on individuals for 95 years. Let's see what happens when it tries to consume itself. He lit the first fire in the cellar, near the heart room. Then he ran through the house, igniting each prepared location. The flames spread quickly through the old dry wood. As the house burned, something extraordinary happened. The walls began to scream, not with terror, but with relief. And then people began appearing, stumbling from doors that formed in the flames. Patience, the first victim from 1756, looking exactly as she had the day she vanished. William Ashford, still 12. Daniel, still 23. All 17 victims emerged from the burning house, plus Constance and Dr. Hartley, dazed but alive. They had not aged during their imprisonment. Time had not touched them in that between space. As the last victim emerged, the house collapsed inward, not outward. It didn't spread flames to neighboring properties. It simply fell into itself, into that wound in reality, dragging all its collected dimension with it. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a depression in the ground, as if Ashford Manor had never existed. The survivors scattered. Most wanted nothing more than to forget. But they couldn't. They had been touched by something beyond ordinary reality, and it changed them fundamentally. Constance never recovered her sanity. She spent the rest of her life in an asylum, drawing pictures of impossible geometries and doors that led nowhere. Dr. Hartley abandoned medicine and became a recluse, writing thousands of pages of testimony that no journal would publish. Margaret used her wealth to hunt for other such places, other wounds in reality, and spent her remaining years warning people away from them. The 17 people who had been trapped longer suffered worse. Most died within a year, their bodies unable to readjust to linear time. Those who survived were never quite present, always seeming to exist partially elsewhere, looking at things no one else could see. Only Thomas remained functional. He dedicated himself to documenting what he called liminal architecture, buildings designed or evolved to exist between dimensions. He found evidence of dozens throughout New England, structures that had developed their own hunger, their own awareness. Before he died in 1891, he compiled everything into a manuscript called The Geometry of Hungry Spaces. It was never published, deemed too disturbing, too dangerous. The manuscript vanished from his estate after his death, but copies exist. They surface periodically in estate sales, in forgotten library archives, in the collections of people who investigate the unexplained. The text is difficult to read, not because of the language, but because something about the words themselves seems to shift on the page, to fold into dimensions the eye can't quite follow. In 1932, a historical society tried to locate the site where Ashford Manor had stood. They found the property easily enough, but when they attempted to excavate the depression, they discovered something impossible. The hole was bottomless. They lowered measuring lines 1,000 feet without reaching bottom, and when they listened carefully, they could hear sounds rising from below, knocking, whispers, the sounds of a house that had fallen into itself but had not quite died. The site was sealed and declared unstable. No marker identifies what stood there. No historical plaques tell the story of Ashford Manor. Officially, it's just an abandoned lot that no one will buy, no one will develop, no one wants to think about. But sometimes, people walking past report seeing doors in the air above that empty depression, doors that open onto darkness, doors that whisper promises of shelter, of sanctuary, of a place where you can stay forever. And sometimes, people accept those invitations. They step through doors that shouldn't exist, into spaces between spaces, and they are never seen again. But if you stand at the edge of that depression on quiet nights, you can hear them knocking from inside walls that aren't there, calling out to anyone who will listen, begging for company in their eternal isolation. The house is gone, but the hunger it created still remains, waiting in the spaces between what is and what should never be. What do you think happened to that manuscript Thomas wrote? Do you believe there are other buildings like Ashford Manor still standing, still hungry? Share your thoughts in the comments below.